What if the death of one man could unleash a chain of events so astonishing that an entire nation would be transformed overnight? Picture this: a people standing at the edge of their destiny, their greatest leader gone, and in the blink of an eye, the impossible begins to unfold. Rivers part, courage ignites, and a new era dawns. That's exactly what happened when Moses, the Titan who led Israel out of Egypt, drew his final breath. In this video, we're diving into the 7 shocking things that happened instantly after his death. Moments that turned mourning into miracles and set the stage for a legacy that still speaks to us today. These aren't just ancient tales. They're lessons of faith, resilience, and divine power that hit close to home, no matter where you are in life's journey. Before we step into this incredible story, if you're as captivated as I am by how God moves in the toughest times, hit that like button. It's a small way to say this resonates with you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and join our community. We're unpacking stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss a single one. Now let's walk together into the moments that changed everything. Right after Moses died, picture a man who'd lived longer than most of us could dream, 120 years carved into his bones. Yet his eyes still burned with the clarity of youth, his body unbowed by time. That was Moses, perched atop Mount Nebo, staring into the distance at a land so close he could almost taste its sweetness. A land flowing with milk and honey, the promise he'd clung to through decades of struggle. But there, on that windswept peak, his story reached its final line. Not because his strength failed or his heart gave out, but because the God he'd served with every breath called him to rest. The Bible paints this moment with a tender starkness. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. No grand exit, no crowd to cheer his name, just a quiet departure, alone with the one who'd shaped his destiny. For those of us who've watched the years pile up, who've seen heroes fade, this strikes a chord deep within. Moses wasn't just old, he was a titan, a man who'd faced Pharaoh's wrath, parted a sea with a trembling staff, and carried a nation's hopes on shoulders that never seemed to tire. Yet here he stood, at the edge of everything he'd fought for, only to let it slip from his grasp. Think back to the stories your own family might tell. Those larger-than-life figures who held everything together, whose voices still echo in your quiet moments. Moses was that for Israel, a father to a people who'd stumbled out of slavery into the unknown. 40 years he'd walked with them, through the blistering sands of the wilderness, through their complaints and betrayals, their cries for water and bread. He'd stood before God on Sinai, his face glowing with a light no one could bear to look at, pleading for mercy when they turned to a golden calf. He'd borne their weight, their doubts, their dreams, and now at 120, he looked out over Canaan. Not as a conqueror stepping into victory, but as a guide whose task was done. Deuteronomy tells us his eyes hadn't dimmed, his vigor hadn't waned, a detail that lingers like a whisper of what might have been. Why stop now, when the goal was in sight? For us who've lost someone just when they seem strongest, it's a question that aches. But Moses' death wasn't a tragedy. It was a fulfillment, a sacred handing off. He led them out of Egypt, through the Red Sea's roaring walls, up to this very brink. And as his breath stilled, you can almost hear the silence settle over Nebo, a hush pregnant with what was to come. His people didn't know it yet, but their world was about to turn upside down. This wasn't merely the end of a life, it was the hinge of a nation's fate. Moses had been their anchor, their intercessor, the one who'd stood in the gap when God's anger flared. Remember the time he begged for their lives after the calf, offering his own soul in their place? That was the depth of his love, the burden he carried. Now as he gazed at the land he'd never walk, you can feel the bitter-sweet pang of a mission completed yet unclaimed. For those of us who've watched a parent or mentor step away too soon, it's a familiar sting. The realization that the ones who build our world don't always get to live in it. Moses' final moment wasn't about defeat, it was about trust, a letting go that opened the door for something greater. His eyes closed to the horizon, but in that stillness, a divine spark was already igniting. ready to carry his people forward where he could not. Then came something no one could have foreseen, a farewell unlike any other. No mourners climbed that mountain to bid him goodbye. No hands shaped a mound of earth or carved a marker for the ages. Instead, the Lord himself took Moses into his keeping, laying him to rest in a valley in Moab, facing Beth Peor. The words hit you like a sudden gust. And God buried him there, and no one knows his grave to this day. Stop and let that settle into your soul. The Almighty who'd thundered from Sinai and parted seas, stooped, if we dare imagine it, to cradle his servant in death. For those of us who've stood by a loved one's grave, wondering what lies beyond, this is a scene that stirs the heart. It's not just the act itself, but the why behind it. Moses wasn't a king demanding a monument or a warrior seeking a hero's pyre. He was a man who'd walked with God, who'd spoken to him as a friend speaks, and in that intimacy, he received an honor no human hands could give. Why would God hide the tomb? Why leave no trace for a people who'd followed this man through fire and flood? The answer weaves through the story of Israel itself. Moses was no ordinary leader. He'd been their bridge to the divine, the one who'd brought down the law, who'd seen God's glory and lived. Deuteronomy calls him unmatched. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. That kind of legacy carried a risk. Think of the golden calf forged while Moses was still alive, a sign of how quickly Israel could turn from God to idols. If they'd known his resting place, what would stop them from building a shrine, kneeling before a grave instead of the God he served? God's burial was a shield, a final act of love to keep Moses' memory holy, untainted by human weakness. For us, who've seen faith twisted into superstition, it's a sobering thought, a reminder that even the greatest among us point beyond themselves. Picture that valley in Moab, holding a secret no one would uncover. No stone marked the spot, no pilgrims traced the path. It was just Moses and his maker, a farewell wrapped in mystery. For those who've lost someone irreplaceable, there's a strange solace in this absence. We don't always need a place to mourn. Sometimes the not knowing becomes its own kind of reverence. Moses' hidden tomb wasn't a loss of memory. It was a crown of grace, a testament to a bond deeper than earth could hold. And while the people below went about their days cooking meals and tending flocks, they had no idea their prophet's departure was already rippling outward. They'd lost a voice that had shaped their very identity, a man who'd stood between them and destruction more times than they could count. But in that hidden valley, as the dust covered his resting place, God was moving, setting the stage for a shock that would echo through their tents and hearts. Down in the camp, life rolled on like it always had. The smell of bread baking, the chatter of children, the rustle of daily tasks. No one knew the mountain above them had gone silent. Moses was gone, but the people hadn't felt the weight of it yet. They were still a nation in waiting, poised at the edge of a dream they'd wandered toward for 40 years. And then, in that unsuspecting moment, God spoke. The book of Joshua begins with a voice that cuts through the ordinary. After the death of Moses, my servant, the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses is dead. Now rise, take this people across the Jordan into the land I am giving them. For anyone who's faced a sudden shift, losing a pillar of strength, stepping into a void, this feels achingly real. There's no gentle easing in, no time to mourn or question. The news of Moses' death hadn't even settled, yet God's call came swift and sure, a command wrapped in purpose. Joshua didn't stumble into this role by accident. He'd been Moses' shadow, his steady companion through the wilderness years. Imagine the trust forged in those decades, the late-night talks as Moses wrestled with God's will, the moments Joshua stood by as miracles unfolded. Now that trust bore its fruit. God's words weren't vague or distant. They were direct, like a father speaking to a son. Moses is dead, now it's you. And with that call came a promise that must have steadied Joshua's trembling soul. No one will stand against you all your days. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. For those of us who've taken up a mantle we didn't seek, a family to lead, a burden to bear, This is a lifeline through the dark. The God who'd shaken Egypt with plagues, who'd fed a nation with manna, was now turning his gaze to Joshua. While the people mourned for 30 days, as their customs required, Joshua held a secret charge. They wept for a past slipping away, but he stood ready for a future bursting forth. This wasn't chaos. It was a plan unfolding with precision. God didn't let Israel falter, didn't leave them leaderless, even for a heartbeat. Joshua's call was the first shock after Moses' death, a spark that turned grief into motion. Think of the times in your own life when loss seemed to signal an end, only for something new to break through. That's what was happening here. The people didn't see it yet. Their tents still hummed with routine, their hearts still heavy with what they'd lost. But Joshua knew. He'd been chosen not just to follow, but to lead, to carry a promise forward where Moses could not. And as he stood there, God's voice ringing in his ears, the weight of a nation began to settle on him. Not as a burden to crush, but as a call to rise. Who was this man stepping into the breach? Joshua wasn't a newcomer, untested and green. He was a son of the desert, shaped by 40 years at Moses' side, a witness to wonders that would stay with him forever. He'd seen the Red Sea part, its waters towering like walls, a path opening where none should have been. He'd tasted the manna that fell each morning, a daily reminder of God's care. He'd watched water burst from a rock, quenching a thirsty people when hope was dry. And he'd been there, one of 12 spies sent to scout Canaan, standing firm with Caleb when the others shrank back in fear. "We can take this land," he'd said, his voice steady while 10 trembled at giants. For those of us who've grown under someone's wing, learning from their strength, Joshua feels like kin, a quiet courage built over years, waiting for its time. Now that time had arrived, and it was no small thing. Following Moses meant more than leading a people. It meant stepping into a shadow cast by miracles and sacrifice. Moses had been the voice of God, the one who'd climbed Sinai and returned with laws that defined them. Joshua had seen him plead for Israel's life, offering his own in their stead when they'd strayed. He'd watched Moses strike the rock, call down plagues, guide 1 million souls through a wilderness that should have been their grave. How do you follow a man like that? For Joshua, it wasn't about matching Moses' feats. It was about carrying his faith. God didn't demand he replicate the past. He promised to walk with him into the future. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you," the Lord said, a vow that must have echoed through Joshua's every doubt. For anyone who's taken up a role too vast to fathom, a parent after loss, a leader after a legend, this rings true. The past wasn't a chain, it was a foundation. Joshua stood on the slopes of Moab, God's call burning in his chest, and the weight didn't break him, it forged him. He'd seen Moses falter, seen him triumph, seen him trust. Now that trust was his to wield. He wasn't alone. The God who'd parted seas and fed multitudes was with him, just as he'd been with Moses. For those of us who faced a moment where the past hands us the reins, Joshua's story is a mirror. He carried the memory of miracles, the lessons of rebellion, the hope of a promise. And as he listened to God's voice, a nation still mourning below, he felt the stir of something unstoppable. Moses was gone, but the journey wasn't over. It was about to explode into something no one could have predicted. The air in the Israelite camp was thick with sorrow, whispers of Moses' passing spreading like a slow tide. Tents sagged under the weight of uncertainty, voices trembling as they spoke of a future without their guiding light. But in that fragile moment, something extraordinary broke through. Not a sound from the people, but a voice from above, resonating deep within Joshua's soul. 3 times the Lord declared, "Be strong and courageous," each command landing like a hammer forging steel. For those of us who've stood at a crossroads, staring down a path too daunting to walk alone, this repetition feels like a lifeline. It wasn't a casual encouragement. It was a divine infusion, a surge of strength from the one who'd once turned a shepherd into a liberator. Joshua wasn't being asked to muster his own bravery. He was being filled with it, a courage not born of flesh, but of spirit. The Bible captures this in Joshua 1, a moment where heaven reached down to steady a man on the brink. What lay ahead wasn't simple. Joshua wasn't just stepping into a role, he was stepping into a war. Beyond the Jordan loomed fortified cities, Jericho with its towering walls, nations like the Canaanites and Amorites with armies hardened by battle. Humanly speaking, it was a mission doomed to fail, a ragtag people against giants of war. Think of the times in your own life when the odds seemed stacked against you, a burden too heavy, a fight too fierce. That's where Joshua stood, his heart pounding as the echoes of Moses' legacy rang in his ears. But God's words weren't empty, they carried power. "Do not be afraid, do not be dismayed," he said, and with that came a promise. The strength to face what seemed impossible. For us who've leaned on faith when reason faltered, this is a testament to how God equips those he calls. Joshua felt it, a fire kindling within, a resolve that turned trembling knees into steady steps. While the people wept, he was transformed, not by his own will, but by a force greater than himself. This courage wasn't just for him. It was the spark that would ignite a nation, pulling them from grief into glory. That triple command wasn't random. It was a rhythm of reassurance. Once might have been enough for a lesser task, but 3 times signaled the magnitude of what awaited. Joshua wasn't replacing a mere man. He was following a legend whose staff had split seas, whose voice had brought God's law to earth. The weight of that could have crushed him, but instead it lifted him. For those who've carried a legacy, perhaps a family name, a parent's dream, this resonates deeply. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the presence of something stronger. And as Joshua stood, hearing those words, the camp's lament faded into the background. He wasn't alone in this. The God who'd walked with Israel through 40 years was pouring himself into this moment. The second shock after Moses' death wasn't a collapse, but a rising. A man fortified by heaven, ready to lead where no one else could. But courage alone wouldn't carry Joshua through. God gave him more, a lifeline etched in words, a guide to keep him steady when the path grew dark. "Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you," the Lord instructed. "Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it." For those of us who've sought wisdom in hard times, this feels like a familiar anchor. It wasn't enough to feel brave. Joshua had to live it, to root himself in the commands that had shaped Israel's journey. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition, a key to unlocking the promise of success. The law wasn't just rules. It was a living thread, connecting him to the God who'd spoken through Moses, a map for a mission that would test every ounce of his resolve. Think of Moses, how he'd poured himself into those words. He'd climbed Sinai twice, the second time with a broken heart after Israel's betrayal with the calf. He'd carried those tablets down, his face alight with God's glory, and taught them to a people prone to forget. Joshua had seen it all, the exhaustion in Moses' eyes when the burden grew too heavy, the moments he'd pleaded with God alone. Now that same law became Joshua's strength, a shield against the chaos ahead. "Meditate on it day and night," God said. And you can almost picture Joshua tracing those commands in his mind, words of justice, mercy, obedience, letting them sink into his bones. For us who've clung to a verse or a prayer when life unraveled, this is a mirror. The law wasn't a burden, it was a gift, a compass to guide him where Moses had stumbled. Unlike Moses, who'd sometimes borne the weight solo, Joshua was given a model of dependence, not on his own wisdom, but on God's unchanging truth. This was more than strategy, it was survival. The battles looming weren't just against flesh and blood, they were against doubt, division, despair. The law gave Joshua clarity when the fog of war thickened. Picture him late at night, the camp quiet around him, whispering those words to himself. "You shall have no other gods before me. Love your neighbor as yourself." Each line was a brick in the foundation of his leadership, a reminder that victory wouldn't come from might alone, but from alignment with the one who'd promised it. For those who've led through uncertainty, a family, a community, this speaks volumes. Joshua's courage wasn't reckless. It was rooted, tethered to a truth that had carried Israel from Egypt's chains to this very moment. And as he held that law close, it became his sword and shield, preparing him for the shock that would soon jolt the nation awake. Then came the third shock, a sudden burst of action that shattered the stillness of morning. Just 3 days after Moses' death, Joshua's voice rang out, "Prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you will cross this Jordan to take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you." 3 days. Not weeks, not months. Just 3 fleeting days to turn a grieving people into a force ready to march. For those of us who faced a moment where life demands we rise before we're ready, this hits hard. The camp didn't have time to linger in sorrow. Tents were folded, bags packed, food gathered in a flurry of motion. Parents bent low to their children, voices soft but urgent. This is the land we've waited for, the place your grandparents dreamed of. The air buzzed with a strange mix of loss and anticipation, a people shaken from their tears into purpose. This wasn't chaos. It was a miracle of unity. 40 years they'd wandered, a generation lost to disobedience, their bones bleaching in the desert. Now, under Joshua's command, there was no delay, no debate. "All you have commanded us, we will do," they answered, their voices steady with a trust that must have stunned even him. Think of the loyalty Moses had earned, the way they'd followed him through plagues and promises, even when they faltered. That loyalty didn't die with him. It flowed to Joshua like a river finding a new course. For us, who've seen trust shift in our own lives, perhaps from a parent to a sibling, a mentor to a friend, this is a powerful echo. Joshua didn't demand it, he inherited it, a testament to the years he'd stood faithful beside Moses. The camp became a hive of purpose, mothers kneading dough, fathers sharpening tools, every hand moving as one. The Jordan loomed ahead, its waters a barrier to some, but to them, a gateway. What drove this speed? It was more than Joshua's voice, it was God's timing. The mourning would last 30 days as tradition held, but the mission couldn't wait. 40 years of delay had taught them a bitter lesson. Hesitation breeds loss. Now the promise was too close to squander. For those who've felt time slip away, a chance missed, a dream deferred, this urgency resonates. Joshua's command wasn't just a call to action, it was a call to life, a refusal to let grief define them. And as the third day dawned, the camp stood ready, not a people broken, but a nation reborn. The shock wasn't just the speed, it was the faith that fueled it, a faith that would soon face its greatest test across the river's edge. As the camp buzzed, another shock unfolded, a promise from the past held firm. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, who'd settled east of the Jordan, faced a choice. Moses had granted them that land, rich and ready, but with a catch. Their warriors must cross with their brothers to fight for Canaan before returning home. Now with Moses gone, would they honor that vow? Joshua called them to it. "Remember what Moses commanded you," he said, his voice steady but searching. Their answer came swift and clear. "All you command us, we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go. As we obeyed Moses, so we will obey you." For those of us who've seen loyalty tested, promises made to one generation fading with the next, this is a jolt of hope. 40,000 men kissed their families goodbye, strapped on their gear, and marched west, risking everything for a land not their own. This wasn't just duty, it was devotion. These tribes could have stayed, claiming their inheritance was secure, their debt paid, but they didn't. Their yes to Joshua echoed their yes to Moses, a bridge of trust spanning the change. Picture those warriors, fathers, sons, brothers, leaving behind new homes, green pastures, to join a fight that wasn't theirs by right. For us who've stood by others in their battles, this loyalty stirs the heart. It wasn't about gain, it was about unity, a bond forged in the wilderness, now bearing fruit. Joshua didn't coerce them. He reminded them and they responded, proving the past wasn't forgotten. The Bible notes their words, "Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you," a pledge that must have steadied Joshua's own resolve. This was no small thing. 40,000 strong, they became the backbone of an army poised to conquer. That commitment rippled through the nation, a shock of solidarity when division could have reigned. With Moses gone, the ties he'd built might have frayed, but instead they tightened. For those who've seen a family or community hold fast after loss, this is a mirror. The Eastern tribe's faithfulness wasn't just to Joshua, it was to a promise, to a God who'd led them this far. And as they marched toward the Jordan, their steps echoed a truth. The mission Moses began wasn't dead. It was alive, pulsing through every man who answered the call. The camp, once heavy with mourning, now thrummed with purpose. A people united not by one man, but by the one who'd guided them all along. As the camp pulsed with newfound purpose, Joshua turned his gaze across the Jordan, where the walls of Jericho stood like a silent challenge. He didn't rush in blindly. His next move was a quiet, calculated stroke of wisdom that stunned with its precision. In the stillness, he summoned two men, whispering a mission. Go, view the land, especially Jericho. This wasn't a grand expedition. It was a secret venture, a sharp departure from the past. For those of us who've learned from hard-earned lessons, perhaps a misstep that cost us dearly, this feels like a nod of recognition. Years before, 12 spies had crossed into Canaan, and 10 returned with fear-soaked words that sparked a rebellion, sentencing a generation to wander. Joshua had been one of those 12, his faith drowned out by the majority's panic. Now he rewrote the story. 2 men, not 12, stealth, not fanfare, a plan honed by experience, aimed at success rather than chaos. Those spies slipped across the river, their steps cautious but resolute, and found an unlikely ally in Rahab, a woman of Jericho whose life hung on the fringes. Her words to them carried a weight that must have stopped them cold. I know the Lord has given you this land. Fear of you has fallen on us. All the people here are melting in terror. For anyone who's seen the ripple of a reputation, good or bad, this is a moment to savor. Rahab spoke of tales that had lingered for 40 years. The Red Sea's parting, Egypt's downfall, miracles that still haunted the hearts of Canaan's people. We heard and our courage dissolved, she confessed, her voice trembling with awe. Your God is the God of heaven and earth. Picture those spies crouching under flax on her roof, hearing this. Enemies already defeated not by swords, but by the echo of God's power. For us who've felt the strength of a story outliving its teller, this rings true. The spies returned with a report that lit a fire. The land is ours, its people are undone before us. Unlike the despair of old, this was a shout of triumph, a shock that turned whispers of doubt into a roar of confidence. This wasn't just tactics, it was faith refined. Joshua didn't repeat the past mistakes. He leaned on what he'd learned, trusting God's timing over human numbers. The mission's success wasn't in the spies' stealth alone, but in the revelation they brought back. The enemy was already broken. For those who faced a foe, be it illness, hardship, or fear, and found it weaker than it seemed, this is a victory of the Spirit. Joshua stood at the Jordan's edge, the spies' words fueling his resolve, and the camp behind him stirred with a hope they hadn't known in decades. The fifth shock wasn't loud, it was subtle, a quiet move that shifted the tide before a single battle began. Then came a moment that shook the earth itself, a spectacle so vivid it burned into the memory of every soul present. The Jordan stood before them, its waters swollen from the harvest season, a barrier daring them to cross. Joshua didn't flinch. He sent the priests ahead, the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, and gave a command. When you see the Ark move, follow it. For those of us who've waited for a sign, a breakthrough after years of struggle, this feels like the air before a storm breaks. The priests stepped into the flood, their feet touching water that should have swept them away. And then it happened. The river stopped. Upstream, the waters piled high, a wall of liquid held back by an unseen hand, while downstream, the bed lay dry. The Bible says it simply, the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant. But for anyone there, it was anything but simple. It was a thunderclap of divine might, a shock that turned a river into a road. This wasn't just a crossing, it was a declaration. God spoke to Joshua, "Today I will exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so they know I am with you as I was with another." For us who've longed for proof that hope isn't lost, this is a moment of awe. The people watched, breathless, as the ark led the way, half a mile ahead, a sacred distance that let every eye see the miracle unfold. Children clung to their mothers, old men who'd seen the Red Sea whispered in wonder, and a generation born in the desert stared at their own marvel. The Jordan wasn't the Red Sea's vast expanse, but its raging flood made this no less stunning. God chose the hardest moment, when the waters were fiercest, to show his hand, proving his power hadn't faded. For those who faced an obstacle too big to move, this is a shout of triumph. What stands against you can be split wide open. The crossing marked more than a step into Canaan. It was a bridge from one era to another. The priests stood firm in the riverbed, the ark a beacon, until every last soul passed through. Joshua's voice carried over the crowd. This is how you'll know the living God is among you. He will drive out your enemies. For us who've crossed our own Jordans, moments of doubt, grief, or change, this resonates. It wasn't just about land, it was about trust, a people stepping into a promise they'd only heard in stories. The shock wasn't the dry ground alone, it was the realization that the God who'd led them this far was still leading, his presence as real now as it had ever been. And as their feet touched the other side, the river roared back to life, sealing the miracle in their hearts. Before that crossing, though, came a hush, a call that stilled the camp's fervor. Joshua stood before the people, his voice steady but urgent. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. For those of us who've prepared for something sacred, a vow, a turning point, this carries a weight that settles deep. It wasn't enough to march. They had to be ready, not just in body but in soul. The word consecrate wasn't casual. It meant cleansing, setting apart, a shedding of the old to meet the holy. They washed their clothes, stilled their hands, turned their hearts inward, preparing for a God whose wonders demanded reverence. This wasn't new. Years before, at Sinai, they'd done the same, trembling as thunder rolled and God descended. Now Joshua echoed that call, linking past to present with a thread of awe. Why this step? The Jordan's parting wasn't a mere tactic. It was a sacred act, a moment where heaven touched earth. For us who felt the need to pause before a big leap, perhaps a prayer before a choice, a quiet moment before a storm, this is a mirror. Joshua knew victory didn't rest on strategy alone. It rested on the one who gave it. Tomorrow wonders, he said, and you can feel the camp's pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. They weren't just crossing a river, they were crossing into God's promise, and that required a purity of purpose. For those who've stood at life's thresholds, wondering if they're worthy, this speaks. The shock wasn't just the miracle to come, it was the preparation, a people made holy for a God who hadn't changed. The same holiness that shook Sinai now hovered over the Jordan, a reminder that their strength lay not in numbers, but in alignment with Him. This call reshaped them. As they cleansed themselves, they shed more than dirt. They shed doubt, the weight of 40 years, the scars of wandering. Joshua didn't promise ease. He promised wonders, and that meant trust. For us, who've sought renewal after loss or drift, this is a beacon. The seventh shock wasn't loud, it was intimate, a quiet revolution in their spirits. And as night fell, the camp glowed not with fire, but with readiness, a people poised for a marvel that would define them forever. The wonders came, and with them Joshua wove a legacy that stretched beyond the moment. After the Jordan parted, he called 12 men, one from each tribe, to pull stones from the riverbed where the priests had stood. They hauled them to Gilgal and built a monument, rough and unpolished, but eternal. When your children ask, "What do these stones mean?" Joshua said, "Tell them the Jordan stopped before the Lord's ark." For those of us who've left markers, a letter, a story, for the next generation, in this hits home. It wasn't about glory, it was about memory, a tangible echo of a day when God moved. Those stones stood as a question and an answer, a bridge for fathers to tell sons, mothers to tell daughters of a promise kept. The camp settled at Gilgal, and soon after, they faced another shock. Every man was circumcised, a renewal of a covenant long neglected, a painful but sacred return to their roots. That wasn't all. At Gilgal, they ate the Passover, lamb and unleavened bread under Canaan's sky, the first time since Sinai. For us, who've marked milestones with rituals, a meal, a prayer, this is a full circle. The next day, they tasted the land's grain, and the manna stopped, a quiet end to 40 years of provision. Joshua led them through these shifts, not as a warrior alone, but as a keeper of faith. Years later, old and weathered, he gathered them at Shechem, his voice firm. "Choose this day whom you will serve." The people swore to God, but Joshua's own vow cut deeper. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." For those who've stood firm in belief, passing it down, this is a clarion call. He set a stone there too, a witness to their oath, a final act tying his life to theirs. Joshua's legacy wasn't in battles won, though he won many, but in the faith he planted. The Bible says Israel served God all his days, and those of the elders who'd seen the wonders. For us who've watched faith flicker in our own time, this is both hope and warning. He died at 110, buried in Ephraim, leaving no successor, only a people shaped by his hands. The shock of his life wasn't just the miracles, it was the enduring mark he left, a testament to a God who keeps his word through every storm. So here we are, at the end of a journey that began with a single, earth-shaking loss. Moses' death didn't signal the end. It sparked a beginning, a cascade of 7 shocking events that prove God's faithfulness doesn't falter, even when our giants fall. From Joshua's heaven-sent courage to the Jordan's parted waters, from a nation's swift rise to a legacy etched in stone, this story whispers a truth we all need to hear. The God who led then still leads now, through every change, every challenge. It's not about the leader, it's about the one who calls them, who calls us to step forward when the way seems shut. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where loss opened a door you never expected? Maybe a time when faith carried you across your own Jordan? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how this story echoes in your life. If it moved you, hit that like button to let us know, and share this video with someone who needs a spark of hope today. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. We've got more stories coming your way, tales of grit and grace that remind us we're never alone. Thanks for joining me on this one, and see you in the next video.